Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started now. For those who don't know me, my name is Jeremy Paul. I'm now the Dean at Northeastern University School of Law. On behalf of everyone here, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event. The title of the event is What Now?, which I think reflects a lot of how we're all feeling after last week. But, of course, this event is not about that, but about an equally important topic, which is the question of school assignment and school quality in the Boston public schools. I'd like to thank the Program on Human Rights in the Global Economy, affectionately known as FERGI, for sponsoring this event, Kevin Murray for putting it all together, and all of our panelists and our moderator for being here. When I lived in Connecticut, where I was for 23 years, there was a professor at Yale Law School, who will go nameless, who, when schools were canceled as a result of snow, decided that he was the resident expert and went on the public radio to talk about the terrible choices that the school officials had made in canceling classes too easily. And in about the space of the next 10 minutes after he had gotten quiet, 15 people who actually knew something about schools called in and explained that everything he said was wrong, that the buses didn't work the way he thought that they did, and his immediate diagnosis from afar was inaccurate. So I'm not going to make that mistake and think that I can tell you anything about the school situation in Boston that our panelists won't tell you, since they're the experts. I will say, though, that I do think there's a great connection between this topic and the Program on Human Rights in the Global Economy, because in a certain way, everything went wrong in the United States with respect to school quality when San Antonio versus Rodriguez was decided. And the Supreme Court, in its wisdom, concluded that education was not a fundamental right under our Constitution, and therefore it was perfectly okay for the state of Texas to so unequally fund the public schools as to make it extremely imperative that one live in a relatively wealthy district. Justice Marshall wrote a great dissent in that case, explaining that if you believed in free speech and thought that was a fundamental right, it didn't really make any sense to say that you believe in free speech, but you don't believe in protection for education. But of course, he lost the vote, and we've been chasing down that topic ever since. I know Massachusetts had its own issues. In Connecticut, where I was from, our school was very proud to be the home school for the litigation that led to the Sheff versus O'Neill decision. One of my colleagues at Connecticut, John Britton, was the lead attorney for the plaintiffs in that case, and it led to a landmark decision, although not necessarily to as much reform as many of us were hoping to see. So I'm looking forward to hearing about the Massachusetts experience. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Kevin Murray, who will say a little bit more about tonight's panel. And so thank you all very much for being here.
Hello. It's nice to see you all here. As Dean Paul said, I'm Kevin Murray. I'm the director of the Program on Human Rights in the Global Economy. Very exciting to be having this discussion here tonight. And I'm here to very quickly do three things. One is to welcome you all and thank everybody who made this possible, including the dean and people from the law school who dealt with the food issues and a lot of other things during it, sort of at the last moment, in a time when things were not working exactly as they generally work around here. So I really have to thank everybody for their efforts. And also Mariah McGill and Khadijah and Boop, who are the two other staff people in Fergie who are here with us tonight. Thank you. I also want to say just briefly a little bit about Fergie. Fergie is a human rights center here at the law school, a human rights program. And there are two things that make it stand out. One is that it's at Northeastern. And being at Northeastern School of Law is a special place for a human rights program to be because of the special interest that the faculty and the students have here in the human rights topics that we're dealing with. The second thing that makes it stand out is that among the human rights centers at law schools in the United States, we believe we're the only ones that has an explicit focus on economic, social, and cultural rights, one of which is the right to education, which leads us to the conversation we're going to have tonight. And the third thing I want to do tonight is just quickly introduce the Northeastern faculty member who's graciously consented to be our moderator tonight. Peter Enrich has a long history of work with the state government in Massachusetts on education issues. He's a well-known expert in financing issues related to public education and a professor here at the law school. And so we're very happy to have him here tonight. He knows many of the panelists and many of the issues that we're dealing with very well. So, Peter, I'm happy to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I think I'm going to at least set the precedent of speaking from the table here, although our speakers are certainly welcome if you'd prefer to use the podium to do that. But I'm hoping this is going to be a little more of a conversation as we move along, and so I'm going to try and model that by sitting here. Thank you very much for coming. Welcome. I hope this is going to be an interesting and productive discussion. I think I should start by saying that, contrary to what Kevin says, there's some issues in education that I know a fair amount about, but the school assignment issues in Boston are one that I suspect certainly everyone else on the panel knows far more than I, and I suspect many of you in the audience do as well. And I think my function is going to be to try and ensure that we can have a rich and interesting conversation about the topic. Let me just say a few words about the game plan. We do have 4 speakers who I think bring 4 really important and distinct perspectives to the issue. We're going to ask each of them, I'm going to start by just saying a few words by way of stage setting and background about the situation that we're going to be addressing. Then we'll give each of the speakers about 10 minutes or so to address a couple of core questions. And then I think we're going to probably immediately after that open it up to comments and questions from the audience. I know there are many people here who have a long-standing interest in this issue and can bring additional insight. So hopefully at that point we can open it up into a general conversation, including you as well as our 4 panelists. My sense is that in the room there are many people who have lived this issue intimately for a good number of years and know its ins and outs very well. There are also some who are approaching this as a relatively new issue. So just let me say a few words by way of stage setting and then introduce the speakers and we'll proceed. The focus for tonight's discussion is the recent decision by the Boston School Committee to adopt a new method of student assignment, which governs assignments primarily for the elementary grades and to some extent for the middle school grades as well. And it's a successor to, over the last 40 years or so, school assignment issues in Boston have been profoundly influenced by the desegregation litigation, which was brought back in the 1970s and which led to a finding that the Boston public schools were unconstitutionally segregated and that required a remedy in the form of reassignment of students throughout the system to break down the racial barriers that had characterized the system. And over the years since those decisions, there have been a couple of different assignment systems that have been designed with a very substantial eye toward addressing the issues of desegregation, the most recent one being a system that essentially divided the city into 3 very large attendance zones and then gave some preference to students who wanted to attend schools that were within walking distance, but to a large extent ensure that students were moved around quite a bit in those very large attendance zones. There's now been about a year-long process, I think, to try and year plus to develop a new alternative plan that could address a range of needs, among them to give parents more choices to have their children in schools closer to their residences. And that process has been managed by an advisory committee that one of our panelists served as a member on, which brought in, held hearings around the city, heard all sorts of evidence from experts and from parents, listened to a wide variety of plans, and finally proposed a plan that was adopted by the school committee last month. And the basic, I'm going to probably horribly oversimplify this, but the essence of the plan is to use a quite sophisticated algorithm that allows each family, based on the location of its residence, a choice of at least 6 and sometimes substantially more than 6 schools that includes at least a number of schools of what the district has assessed as relatively high quality. Sometimes that's accomplished by simply giving them the choice of the 6 schools closest to their home. Sometimes it expands out to a wider range of schools to ensure a range of quality choices. A huge amount of analysis of this plan has been done. There's been a huge amount of discussion of it. From at least a very brief review, what's clear is that although it does provide parents significant choice, there still is significant variation in the range and quality and number of choices that are available to different families, based on the simple fact that there's still a significant geographic variation around the city in where the stronger schools are located. And that has been one of the topics that has attracted considerable interest and concern. The school department has also linked this plan with some very substantial commitments to improving the quality of schools and ensuring a wider range of high-quality schools so that parents will have better choices. And so that's a significant factor that's part of the overall plan. So that's the very quick, simplified overview for those of you who are relatively new to this, and I'm sure the panelists will clarify places in which I have oversimplified or distorted. So let me now introduce the 4 panelists, and I'm going to introduce them in the order in which we're going to invite them to make their initial statements. So first, immediately to my left, is Robert Gittens. Bob was one of the members of that external advisory committee on school assignment that I spoke of. He also, his day job, he's Northeastern University's vice president for public affairs, a position he's held since 2003. His resume is an extraordinary one. Among many other things, he is a former member of the Boston School Committee. He has served the Commonwealth as Secretary of the Executive Office for Health and Human Services. He was Commissioner of the Department of Youth Services. He was First Assistant District Attorney for Suffolk County, and the list could go on at some length. Probably the most important thing on his resume is that he is an alumnus, both of Northeastern University undergraduate and an alumnus of this law school, and we're always delighted to have him come back. To his left is Carlton Jones. Carlton is serving as the Boston Public Schools lead staff person on the student assignment plan. He also serves as the Boston Public Schools Executive Director for Capital and Facilities Management. He recently returned to the Boston Public Schools after spending 3 years as the Chief Operating Officer for the Providence Public Schools. Before his sojourn in Providence, he served in the Boston Public School system for some, I guess, a decade or so in roles in managing capital and strategic planning for the school system. To my extreme right is Megan Wolfe. Megan is the co-founder of Quality Education for Every Student, which is an organization of Boston Public School parents, parents of Boston Public School students. She's a former high school teacher, and she's a resident of Jamaica Plain, where she is the mother of 2 students who are currently in the Boston Public Schools. Finally, to my immediate right is Liz Sullivan. Liz is the Director of Human Right to Education program at the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative, an organization that focuses on a wide range of social and cultural rights issues. Her work has been to carry out research projects to document human rights violations in U.S. public schools around the country, and to provide trainings to parents, youth, and organizers about how to incorporate human rights standards and strategies into their advocacy. Liz has a BA from Brown, a master's in public policy from the Kennedy School, and I hope I won't embarrass her by thanking her for coming here straight back from her honeymoon. So I'm going to ask the four speakers to each speak in the order that I asked to introduce them. We asked them in their initial remarks to focus on two questions. First, what must the Boston Public Schools keep in mind as it implements the home-based assignment system so that the new system increases equity and access to quality education for children across Boston? And as if that weren't enough, second, how do we change the conversation in Boston from one about who gets into what school to how we ensure quality schools for all of Boston's children? So with that, Bob, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Peter. I'm very happy to be here. It's very happy to see so many of you. I see the folks from Northeastern, from the law school, and folks who have been involved in this dialogue for well over a year, if not much longer. And I think it's encouraging that we have so many folks here who have followed this process closely for more than a year. I know there are others who have been involved in this issue much longer than that. But it was a pretty intense process that the External Advisory Committee went to. And when I see people, including tonight, when I see people who have been involved in that process, the comment is, aren't you glad you're not going to all of those meetings 3 or 4 times a week? And part of my remarks are going to touch a little bit upon that because I want to talk about how important that is for the city. But as Peter was doing the introduction and going over some of the things in my past, it brought to mind that I've been around for quite a while. And it brought back my undergraduate days here at Northeastern. And I make this point not just to tell an anecdote, but really to highlight how much this city has changed in somewhat of a short period of time. So I was an undergraduate here between 1970 and 1975 and was a co-op student who had my first co-op job in Washington, D.C. I graduated from the Boston Public Schools, had come to Northeastern, and I was fortunate enough to get a job working with the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department in the education section. And when I first arrived at that job, I was introduced to Tom Keating, who was the section chief for that department. We were chatting, and at one point I said, when are you going to do something about Boston? And he looked at me and he said, Boston? There's not a problem in Boston. You have you have the racial imbalance law in Boston. Well, one of the things that I did as an undergraduate student is I kept that co-op job, so I kept going back up until 1975. And by the time I left, the Justice Department was deeply involved in Boston. And as a result of that, we had the school assignment plan that we're talking about that has essentially remained intact since that time. My other experience is as somebody coming to Northeastern for work, having been on the school committee and been involved in these issues, I would drive to work and oftentimes would end up stopped behind a school bus at the Greenwood School in Dorchester, and I would see elementary-age students getting on that bus, and I'd be thinking to myself, they're getting on a bus to go somewhere to get educated when there's a school right here. There was something about that image that just said, we can do better than this. And so the opportunity to serve on the External Advisory Committee was one that I was very receptive to. And I think we started a dialogue across this city. And I've tried to think about whether I can think of a comparable example of a large city undertaking that type of ongoing discussion on an important issue that had so much interaction between the community, between an advisory committee and policymakers. And I can't think of one. And I think that's something we need to take a lesson from, because I honestly think this is a dialogue that needs to continue, because even if the Supreme Court doesn't see education as a constitutional right, we all know how important it is to our survival as a democracy and for the functioning of our economy. And so the External Advisory Committee, in looking at school assignment, we were asked to take a look at and make recommendations on changes and improvements to the school assignment plan. And integral to that was the question of how we align a new system with enhancing students' opportunity to access quality schools. We understood from the outset that Boston has made significant progress in improving school performance, but we still have far too many schools that are not quality schools. And we also recognize that, unfortunately, many of those schools are located in certain neighborhoods. And so we did a lot of work with a lot of input from folks, looking at how we can make sure that students across the city had access to greater opportunities for quality. And thanks to all the folks who were in many of those meetings and discussions, helped shape how we looked at that. And for those who were involved, I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but we had a graduate student from MIT who came forward with a proposal of how we could redesign it to get away from a zone-based system to one that, as Peter mentioned, has an algorithm that is what we call home-based. It's centered in a student's home, and it looks at a variety of options that are close to that student's home that allows a family to select from top quality schools, schools that are not yet top quality, and those that are underperforming. And so that was, thanks to that input and a lot of feedback, that was what's known as the home-based A plan that was recommended by the EAC and adopted by the school committee. And so we really focused a lot on the issue of quality. And if we look at quality, it was very interesting to see the feedback that we got from so many people. Now we had, I don't know, I've heard various numbers, 70 to 100 meetings in the community. We had over 5,000 participants. We did surveys. And we got a lot of input about what parents and families think of as quality. And there was a tremendous amount of variation. And so in looking at that question of quality, one of the things that we recommended was, well, we said we can't parse this out because we don't have a way of quantifying a lot of that data at the present time. And so going forward, our recommendation was that the school department look at various criteria for measuring quality. What we used was a formula based on MCAS scores and school performance over a 2-year period. But we said that that data doesn't cover the range of what families are considering when they look at a quality school. So one of the things going forward is to look at how families measure quality, what they consider in selecting a quality school. I think the discussion that we have started here in Boston is one that needs to be carried forward for an important reason. Oftentimes I'm sure other cities do the same thing, is we look at ourselves and say, why aren't we doing things at a much higher level? And I think, as in all communities, we need to be reflective and self-critical at times. But we're facing challenges that every other large urban district is facing across this country. It is not unique to the city of Boston. And by many measures, Boston actually outperforms most other large cities. But there's a real issue with how we're meeting the educational needs of many communities. And so looking at how we do that going forward, I think, is a critical part of that conversation. Coming out of the set of recommendations that we've put forth, we recommended that there be an ongoing committee to look at the issue of quality and how it's implemented. The superintendent has adopted that recommendation. There are a series of recommendations that we've incorporated that I think will help us continue the dialogue around quality. But we need to think about how we meet the needs of families that may be coming from different perspectives. And now I'm talking about sort of my own perspective at the moment as opposed to the EACs, the External Advisory Committee. One of the issues we have to think about is how we work with low-income families. Some of you may be familiar with a writer named Annette Leroux who has looked at the question of how families who are low-income approach a school district from those who are upper income. And so what I think we've put in place is a model that allows us to have a dialogue that can focus resources in ways of meeting those families in the community in a more effective way. How we can help empower them. And BPS has done this in many ways. If you, some of you are familiar with Parent University. There are ways of working with families so that they can be better consumers of the educational system. And so building on that groundwork, I think will be very helpful. I believe that getting families more engaged in your local school is very important, but others have pointed out, correct me if I'm wrong, Kim Janey, who's here, may have been the one to point this out. There really isn't evidence that shows that having students go to the school that's closest and getting parents involved results in improved, pardon?
No, that's not yet. I'm sorry, I'm agreeing with you.
Okay, not improved. And I understand that. But at the same time, I think there are ways of connecting with families and getting parents involved in a way that really empowers them, as I said, to be effective consumers of the educational system. And so I think there's the model in place allows for that continued dialogue. So I look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. So good evening, everyone. I'm Carlton Jones again, and I am not the superintendent. She was originally invited to be on this panel. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to be here tonight, so I do not in any stretch of the imagination stand in for her, but I hope I can at least present perspective on this subject, since I've been involved in it in many ways for quite a while, actually. I just want to point out that not only am I sitting beside an esteemed former member of the school committee and also a tirelessly serving member of the External Advisory Committee, but we also have another one, Ms. Helen Dahir, who's sitting here in the beautiful red jacket over there. She was the co-chair of the External Advisory Committee and also a former school committee. And I say this in the best possible way. Helen and I go way back, because we go back to the 1994 effort. I'm sorry, 2004. Holy cow. Sorry, not that far back. The 2004, thank you for the correction. It does, actually. The 2004, I'll tell you why I said 19 in a second. The 2004 effort to improve student assignment in Boston. I actually started at City Hall in '92 is what kind of threw me a little bit. But in City Hall, I was working on capital projects, came to the school department in '98 to work on school projects. And it was in 2001 when then Superintendent Payzant and then Chief Operating Officer Michael Contapasas came to a couple of us and said, we have to do something about our student assignment system. What we're doing now is just not working. In his words, it's just flat crazy. It's crazy that we are sending kids all over town in search of something that they may or may not be getting at that point when they get there. And what do I mean by that? As Bob mentioned, the Sarah Greenwood example, which I think is really powerful, that happens all over the city, all over town. And I used, when we were doing our community meetings, I used two examples of many examples. But one example I used was one from two children. One child who lives in Hyde Park near a school called the Roosevelt, literally very close. I won't say exactly where it is, but very close to the Roosevelt school, and travels over 8 miles to go to South Boston to another school. I'm not going to name the other school. I'm not talking about the other school, but goes to another school in South Boston. That school is in terms of performance, as one measure of quality, performs way less or much lower in performance than that school that person lives near, but yet is traveling 8 miles one way. So this happens to and fro daily. There is another child who lives in South Boston who lives near that other school and travels, guess where? To the Roosevelt. And so these kids are crossing each other in the night. Now, I'm not going to speak to the quality of either school, really. I'm just going to say that something's wrong with that equation, because think of all the schools that they're passing along the way. And do they really, truly need to go 8 miles in order to find the quality education that their parents presumably are looking for? We think not. And then Dr. Payzant was saying this is absolutely insane. And he didn't use the example I used, but that's the situation. There's another example of kids who go even further. I mean, if you look at the north zone, so we talked about the 3 zones, the 3 attendance zones that we currently have, one in the north, one on the east, and one on the west. There's a child who lives near Newton who travels to behind Boston Logan to a school. And then there's one who lives right behind that school who's going, guess what, over to Alston-Bright in the other direction. And this happens not just, these are not the outliers. These are rather regular occurrences. I'm not speaking about special needs students. I'm not speaking about English language learners. These are 4 general education students who are just traveling. Now, one can argue there are many reasons why families choose schools, and there might be some really, really compelling reasons why the parents chose those schools as they did, but this happens so often. And so the point was, we do not need to have a system where families, for whatever reason, have to travel quite so far in order to find a quality education. And so that's what this was all about, how to improve the system so that we're really not putting impediments up, how to improve the system so that we can actually serve families better, to allow school communities to develop closer to home. Now, again, there was always this thing, and if John Mudd were sitting here, he'd say, yeah, it's not about transportation. Yeah, there was always in the back of our minds this thought that if we do this, we could save money on transportation. That came up several times. But we began to see that for a variety of reasons, that transportation dollar figure, it just wasn't going to be there. And it began to become less of a focus for that reason, because it wasn't originally about transportation, but there are many of us on the operations side saying, yeah, guess how much money we could save. You know, we always thought that would be something that would be a side benefit of this. But it was really about quality education for students so that they did not have to travel so far away in order to get there. So what does this look like? So now that we have a vote, now that the External Advisory Committee has made the recommendation, Dr. Johnson has made the recommendation, the school committee has voted. Now what? So many of us in Boston Public Schools set out to plan the implementation for this new thing. What are we going to do? How are we going to get this done? And I see some friends sitting around. I see a lot of you who we've had lots of conversations about. And one of the things that I've had the pleasure of saying was, in my mind, this was not about student assignment necessarily. Yeah, we were talking about how kids land in schools, but it really wasn't so much about that. But it was about how do we, as a district, ensure that we are doing what we said we're going to do as it relates to improving quality across the district. Because that was clearly the conversation. Clearly, at every meeting we went to, every meeting the External Advisory Committee had, quality, quality, quality was at the forefront. The External Advisory Committee had 3 subcommittees. One of the subcommittees was, of course, the Quality Subcommittee for that reason. How do you define quality? And as you probably can guess, quality means very many different things to very many different people. And so how do we come up with a definition of even quality? And how do we ensure that we know it when we see it? Can we measure it? Maybe one of the disappointments, if anyone were ever to say that, as a staffer I would say, is that we never really got to the holy grail of what does quality look like, what is that quality definition. Fortunately, Mayor Menino and Dr. Payzant have wanted the work to continue, and so there's going to be a quality working group to continue to tackle that question. What is quality? How do we know it when we see it? How do we measure it? How do we provide a measure for families to be able to say, well, if it means these 3 things to me and it means those 4 things to you, I can choose my school based on my definition. And you can choose your school based on your definition. We all have a universal ranking system, hopefully. This is the holy grail. A universal system that we can have the schools tiered so that families can say, aha, I get it. If we're using this measure, then we see how schools are ranked. The neat thing there is that there should be a threshold that says no matter what goes on, no matter what families think, no matter what their individual choices may be, we are saying that this is the threshold that if a school is above the threshold, we're saying, okay, we're pleased. We think that the good things are going on. And if they're below that threshold, we have work to do. And that, I'm hoping, as an individual, I will say, as an individual, I'm hoping that that's what the quality working group will take on and be able to achieve. It's not an easy subject, as you know. It's not an easy task. After the 2004 task force, there was a quality working group that came after that as well, because even back then, that was the thing, quality, 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 quality. And recommendations came out of that task force that arguably someone could say did actually go into effect, and some would also say probably didn't, or many of the directives that came from that quality task force then never really got underground, never got underway, whatever. So as we looked at the implementation, we said, okay, how do we ensure we do everything that we said we were going to do? And I was one of the planners for the work that's happening now to say, okay, we need to be able to record all that stuff, all of those directives, all of those recommendations, all of those stuff is the best word I can think of at the moment, but all of those items that the EAC came up with and that the recommendation says. So it's not just about the home-based A, but it's about all those other things that we talked about. How do we improve schools that are not at the highest performing currently? And how do we ensure that we are able to look at them again and say, okay, what's going on and what do we need to do next? How do we ensure that it's not just an operational exercise? You know, as a former CAO, I love to think operations and think, okay, this is how we get it done, and you know, you check off your boxes and you use your balanced scorecard and you're happy. But it's an academic exercise. We need to make sure that the academic side is equally engaged, that the academic team has targets and metrics where they can say, okay, we committed to innovation schools and inclusion schools and all of these various changes that we talked about. How do we ensure that we actually get those done? As an individual, I'm saying that that's what concerns me the most, really, is not the operations side. Because you know what? Operations folks say, hey, this is my job in terms of, you know, making widgets. This is my job. My job is to get the buses to run on time, to put, as I love to say, butts in chairs. I hope that's not a problem. But anyway, you know, assigning students, butts in chairs, that's something that operations folks love to do. We need to make sure that the academic side has supports so that they're equally able to move down a path so we can get to where we need to be able to get to by a particular point in time. We do not have a lot of time. We recognize that even though we talk about September 2014 as the date by which this new student assignment plan will take effect, well, 2014 September means January 2014 assignments, which means fall of 2013 notifications and all that information. So when you start backing up and going through the calendar, you begin to see that, you know, we need to have a lot of work done by end of school year 2013, which is in June. And oh wait, that means that we need to have things decided by May 2013, which is in a little over a week. So that's where we are right now. We are very actively engaged in, oh my gosh, we got to get this done. And we're very actively engaged in trying to ensure that we don't forget about some of these, some of the conversation, or forget about some of the directives, and we have our own internal desires. We say, oh geez, you know what, this is a great opportunity for us to fix this thing that's always been hanging out there, that's been nagging at our side. We want to fix this piece as well. So we're wrapping our arms around a great deal of work, quite frankly, to be able to ensure that what the External Advisory Committee recommended and what Dr. Johnson moved forward and the school committee approved actually gets done, and actually gets done so it meets the policy objectives, and actually gets done in a way that families across the district can say, yes, we do see not only the change, but the change was a good change, the change was the appropriate change, and that families are benefiting from that change. It all comes back to the student or future students. It all comes back to students as they come through, to be able to say that no matter where you land, whether your school is in your neighborhood as you define your neighborhood, or if it's a few blocks away or several blocks away, a mile away, or across town, that wherever you go, you have a high quality opportunity to accelerate the acceleration agenda. Sometimes we talk about accelerating the acceleration, that this is a way for us to accelerate the acceleration for the acceleration agenda, meaning, you know, we're closing the achievement gaps. We want to make sure that that happens more quickly than it has in the past. We want to make sure that all students are, in fact, college and career ready when they come out of high school, so that they have opportunities. And we also want to make sure that, you know, all students are proficient. I can't necessarily say all. That's a goal, all. but certainly students are meeting their performance and proficiency standards as they should. So that's, I think, as a staffer, not as the superintendent, but as a staffer, I think we get it. We actually feel it. We're saying, okay, here's the opportunity to get this work. I will tell you, as Mr. O'Neill comes in, so I won't tell you. All right, so I would have told you, had he not walked in. This is the chairman of the school committee. I would tell you, hi. I would tell you that there's some staffers internally who are saying, man, this is a whole lot of work, and holy cow, and how are we going to get this done? And geez, we don't have any extra resources, and wow, 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 wow. And some of us are saying, yeah, you know what, but guess what? Got her, get her done. This is the work that's in front of us now. This becomes your new work, and we need to work together to figure out how we're going to get it done. But the answer is not, let's go back and ask for, some long laundry list of needs to be able to get this work done. Sure, we might have a short laundry list because we hope that there are others out in the community who wish to support us in this effort. We feel that, when it comes to communicating what's going on, that we might find, some opportunities to be able to leverage some of our business partners to be able to put the word out and to share what's happening. Also to share the great things that are happening. This is not the school district of 2004 or 2001 or 94. Boston Public Schools has improved dramatically over time. I think most would agree that is in fact correct. In many cases, we need to spread the word and share that great information. We also know that there's a lot of work to be done, and so that's where we're rolling up our sleeves, we're diving in, and I have not heard one person yet say they can't do it, so that's a good thing. And I've been at 90% of the meetings, the internal meetings, I will say. So I've yet to hear someone say we cannot get it done. I've heard folks say it's going to be hard, or we're not sure yet what this means. We might need some clarification in some areas, but the good news is that implementation has begun. I had a comment about what that end state might look like later on, which I might reserve for later on, but we're progressing. We're moving.
Megan.
Good evening. So I first want to say thank you to Northeastern for hosting the panel and for inviting me to be on it. I'm far more used to being on the other side of the podium, and I'm far more used to my 2 minutes in question time than I am to a full 10 minutes. So you'll forgive me if I'm a little nervous or stumble over my words. But as Peter said at the beginning, I'm a parent in the Boston Public Schools. I have a 7th grader and a 10th grader who've been in the system since they were 4 years old. So I come to this as a parent. I also come to it as an educator. I taught high school in an alternative program with Boston at Action for Boston Community Development, where I worked with students who had either dropped out of the system or been on the verge of dropping out. And I also come to this as an activist, and that's been my role, I think, over the last year during the assignment process, but prior to that also in my children's schools and around some of our broader issues in the city around bilingual education, around funding, and like I said, over the last year, and actually prior to that around assignment, because my children were in one of the only citywide schools in the system, and so we've been fighting to keep that citywide status for a long time. So assignment has been on my agenda for a long time. And I come as a member of QUEST, Quality Education for Every Student. And QUEST is a group that's made up of parents who have children in over 30 schools in the city. We come from many different areas in the city, and we were really born last summer out of the assignment system. A lot of us found ourselves in meetings around assignment, found ourselves then at events of our kids and expressing concern about the agenda that was on the table set down by the mayor to move to an assignment system that was closer to home. We were concerned about some of the issues in the process, and we were concerned about that potential result because we worried that a new closer-to-home model was potentially going to have terrible effects on equity in our city around education. So we've spent 8 months and for a very long time meeting every single week in a secret location not to be revealed, talking about these issues, talking a lot about assignment, and talking about quality, which really, to be honest, when we first met, we acknowledged that quality was the issue and assignment was way down our list of issues as parents in the Boston Public Schools, and we wish that our time, our energy, and the energy of others in the city was spent on quality as opposed to school assignment. But that's where we were. So we're excited to be here tonight talking about this issue of quality and where we're going and as we're moving ahead. I want to lay down a couple of little caveats. One is that although we've talked a lot about quality and a lot of this thinking comes out of Quest discussions and has been informed by knowledge shared with us by lots of other groups and people, many of whom are in the room tonight, we don't have an official position on what we think needs to happen in rate quality. So I'm going to lay out some ideas, and it's stuff we've talked about, but don't hold us to it. And the other caveat I want to say is that underlying all our understanding about schools is an understanding that we see as parents how much is asked of our schools, our teachers, our principals, all the educators in the city. We see that we ask them to educate our students academically, to attend to their social and emotional needs, their love of art and music, their love of exercise, and we see that that's a lot to demand of schools. And we know that schools have great effect on those issues and on academic success. But much of what happens to our children, and the greatest determinant, in fact, of their academic success, doesn't lie within the control of our schools. Maybe we wish it did. But we know that the biggest determinant of academic success for our children is actually socioeconomic status. It's wealth, income, and social class. And those schools can do things to mitigate some of the effects of poverty. Schools cannot provide housing for our children. They cannot provide every meal for our children. And they can't address all the challenges that our children face because of poverty. So this isn't an excuse for schools. It's not to say that schools can't help with these issues. They absolutely can and they must. But it's a way of acknowledging that educators in schools can't do it alone. So that underlies everything that we need to say today. So where do we go from here? I have sort of 5 main things that I want to say that Quest hopes will be attended to as we move forward. And the first one relates to what we've already talked a little bit about, which is the right to a high-quality education and equal access to that education. And I just learned tonight I never knew what the case was that determined that education is not actually a legal right, which is San Antonio versus Rodriguez, but we understand it as a moral right and an ethical right of our children to have a high-quality education and equal access to that education. And so this is why Quest spent so much time on the assignment process, because we feel like it really related to the rights of all our children in the city to attend the good schools. And the problem in the city is that there are not enough good schools. So the question becomes, well, who gets to go there? I know that earlier we heard a little bit about the issue of travel to schools, and that's really what a lot of the issue became. It became, how do we balance the need of some families to go to school closer to home and to what some people believe is the strength of close-to-home schools, and the belief of other families that I would travel anywhere. I would send my child across the city. I would, in fact, send my child to another city and another town, and I would put them on the bus not for 8 miles, but I would put them on the bus for 15 miles to get them into a good school. And I would pay a lot of money for that, and I would spend a lot of time attending meetings at those schools, and I would do everything that I could to send my child to a school no matter where it was. So those were the 2 things that we were trying to hold. So as we move forward, and one of the questions was what do we need to pay attention to as we move ahead, I do want to get into the weeds for a couple of minutes, because I think that these are issues that we need to pay very close attention to, and issues that Quest is paying attention to. And one of these is, which schools do I get to choose from, and which schools do you get to choose from? And this is called your basket of schools. And so I think it was Bob initially who explained it, is that basket is determined by your home address. So what that means is that my basket is going to look very different from your basket. And in fact, if I live on LaGrange Street in West Roxbury, 87% of the schools in my basket are going to be high-quality schools. If I live on Humboldt Ave in Roxbury, 33% of the schools in my basket are going to be high-quality schools. And that's a major issue. And that's an issue that has not been properly addressed, either by the EAC or by the school committee yet. We believe that it's still on the table. On the night of the vote, it was put on the table by John Barros, one of the school committee members, and we hope that that'll be attended to, because I don't see how we can go forward and say that we have an equitable school system if that's the way that the baskets exist. The other issue that needs to be attended to is the quality metric that's used. We know that it's based on MCAS and a little bit on MCAS growth, but that really doesn't allow us to look at schools in a real way. It allows us to look at one measure of success of a school, and in fact that measure is really highly correlated to socioeconomic status. So what does it really tell us about what's going on in the classrooms of our children? It doesn't tell us about the day-to-day instruction. It doesn't tell us about how our children's other needs besides math and English are being attended to. So we really have to watch. It's on the agenda to have the quality metric change, but that is absolutely critical, and we have to come up with a robust metric in order to really understand what's going on in our schools. The other thing that we really need to look at is the way that families are educated about the new process. For those of you who've been in family engagement centers, we've had mixed experience over the years. I feel like we have to acknowledge, I think, that there's been some improvement, but I know that when I signed my children up for schools, there were things that were going on there that I really wish weren't going on. And the way that we teach our families about the new system, the way that we guide our families to schools, the literature that we use to teach them about it, all have to be really carefully attended to. And finally, as we're looking at the plan and its implementation, we need to do really careful analysis along the way. At the end of the first assignment, the first assignment results, we need to look at who is asking to go where. We need to figure out why. We need to figure out where are they getting assigned. We need to do a really careful analysis based on race and class about who's going to quality schools and who isn't still. We need to see if the algorithm is working as designed and is mitigation needed for our neediest children. We also, in the long term, I think, need to watch real estate patterns, because I've already had an email from a family moving into the city, someone through a friend who said, "Where should I move?" That's a very hard question to answer, I have to say, because the question becomes who's going to move where, and what's that going to do to access for other people and access to that neighborhood, and what's going to happen to real estate prices in those neighborhoods that have high quality schools. So, beyond the assignment plan, number two, besides number one was the right to education and access to high quality education. We have to be willing to go beyond the current dominant conversation about school quality and improvement. In 1983, when A Nation at Risk came out, there was a lot of talk about school reform, and we've seen a lot of efforts since that time. No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, Common Core, charter schools, changes to teacher evaluation. And as education scholar Charles Payne put it, so much reform, so little change. How depressing is that? As parents, we've lived through a lot of the waves of these policies. We've seen our children tested relentlessly. I have personal experience with that. We've had to fight in our schools to retain some semblance of art and music instruction, attention to social and emotional well-being, and push the love of learning over the love of testing. We've also seen our children's teachers and principals beaten down by testing. We've seen fear injected into classrooms and into students, and we've seen many of them leave the profession that they formerly loved. A lot of Okay, I'm going to whip through. A lot of these mandates are top-down mandates, and what we really believe is that what needs to happen is that strong learning communities should be the center of the reform, not the victims of it. Teachers and principals need to be respected as professionals. We need to have teachers that are trained, that are highly valued, that are not robots, instead of fully functioning, caring human beings. We also need to re-envision school success and rely on teachers and principals as experts instead of, frankly, business people and government officials. Fourth is looking at the child's whole needs, because their whole needs must be the center of these communities and these reforms. Our children aren't monolithic. They need lots of things attended to, and they are all different. One answer is not going to work. And as I mentioned, schools can't do this alone. Last one, number 5. There must be long-range planning and solutions that are thoughtful, transparent, and equitable. As stakeholders, we need to ask the questions, who's mandating these plans? And are they paying attention to what's actually going on the ground? Are the plans sound? And how long will they be in place? Because flavor of the day is very hard when you're a teacher in a school. Are capital improvements and programmatic needs based on need, on convenience, or on motivations that are less than transparent? And is there equity in these plans? We at Quest have committed to keeping an eye on the BPS as we move ahead. We're not done, either in looking at the assignment process and in the quest for quality in our schools. We've given our time and, more importantly, our children to BPS. We know what a profound effect the system will have on their lives, as well as on the lives of their neighbors, their future coworkers, their leaders, and their friends. And we believe that by working together, we can and we should hold BPS and ourselves accountable to the promises that have been made. Too often, the promises have been broken, and we need to watch that they will be kept. And we need to hold to the ideals of quality and equity. We do this because we believe it's Boston's obligation to provide all children with a high-quality education, because it's one of their most precious rights and greatest needs.
Probably a good segue.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. So thank you for having me here today. My name is Liz Sullivan. I work for a human rights organization called the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative. We work on the rights to education, housing, healthcare, and workers' rights in the United States. I work on the education program, and we work with different local parent, youth, and teacher organizations in different communities around the country that are fighting for their human right to a quality education and to be treated with dignity in our school systems. And even though there isn't a national, federal, constitutional legal right to an education, everyone does have a human right to an education. And in our work, we work with communities to identify in their community what does it mean to them to have their human right to education realized. And then we also look to international documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which really came from communities all over the world talking about what does it mean to us to have real quality education for our children. And so we look to the standards and the principles that are in those documents as well to hold our local communities and our local school systems to a higher standard for the quality of education they provide. For the last few years, we've been working as part of a national coalition called the Dignity in Schools Campaign, which is a coalition of about 60 organizations from all over the country who are working on the issue of school pushout. And right now in the United States, every year, there's over 1 million young people who drop out from school who don't graduate on time, but we really see this as a push-out crisis, that these students aren't dropping out, but they're being pushed out by the policies and practices like lack of quality education, overcrowding, punitive school discipline, and zero tolerance is an issue we work a lot on, the narrow curriculum and focus on high-stakes testing, and that all these things are undermining quality and pushing our young people out. And so I'll say as a caveat that the issue of school assignment, here in Boston isn't an area of my expertise, but I'm going to talk a little bit about what I've seen in some other cities and what the general human rights framework says about what quality can look like in schools. And so how does school assignment, school choice, and placement relate to human rights? And so certainly we've seen it in our work around school pushout that this issue can have a big impact on pushing young people out of schools. In some cases, you can see it in the way that individual students or families are excluded from access to particular schools, whether it's because of a disciplinary background, because they have special needs, or an English language learner in New York City. In the school assignment process there for high schools, when they started splitting up the big high schools and creating smaller high schools, there were families that were completely excluded from accessing certain schools because they didn't have services available, like special ed or English language learners. So there's a variety of different ways that placement and assignment impacts this human right to education and push out. There's also more subtle ways, and I think two of the human rights principles that especially apply to this issue of school assignment are equity and participation, and the previous speakers have talked about it. I think in equity, a part of it is what are those schools that end up in your basket, and are they high quality, and are there certain people because of where they live that are being denied access to high quality schools? But even within the schools you can choose from, is there a way of really ensuring that families have access to the information they need to choose the schools they want to go to, but also that there aren't a variety of ways that families are counseled into certain schools by the places they go to get information. And so, I've worked in New Orleans, and we saw a lot of that there. It's a very complicated system down there with like charters and public schools, very confusing, and that families are basically pushed and directed into certain schools by people in the district when they go to ask questions because of perceptions, because of history with that student, because of special needs that student has. So all of those issues of equity to access, fairness, and participation are huge issues for how we move forward with a school assignment process. But I think the bigger question, that the panel is talking about today is what does quality really look like? And a school assignment process, like other panelists have mentioned, becomes about people competing to get into a small number of high-quality schools. But instead, how do we change the conversation to how do we make every school high quality so that people can go to quality schools right in their neighborhood? And for the human rights framework and the standards that we look to in the work we do, I want to share 6 key human rights principles that come from the international framework, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but they also really reflect when we go to communities and work for years with student and parent groups that are our partners. These are the things that students and parents want for their schools. So yes, they're in these international documents, but it's also what people know they want to make high-quality schools. So the first principle is the individual right of every child to an education that adapts to meet their needs. And so what does that look like? It's about learning style. It's about what kind of either special education or language or other needs a student has. It also is about the community they come from and the history of that community and how to connect education to the real world that young people are living in. And so when you're looking in Boston at a home-based school assignment system that's about having students closer to home, it's a real opportunity to look at what does a quality education that's about adapting to the needs and the experiences of students in different communities to make it a quality education for them and their families and their history and their perspective and how they want to see education work. So it's an opportunity to really work with communities where schools are based to shape what an education looks like. The second human rights principle is the full development of the child. And that is about going beyond just academic, just math and English and language, but also arts and music and expression, but it's also about social and emotional learning, teaching behavioral skills, teaching social change and making students change agents in their own schools to be a part of the process for improving the education in their schools, but also in their broader community. And so this idea that when we measure the quality of schools and when we strive to shape what our vision for quality schools is, this idea of full development is central. A third principle is dignity. And what does it mean for young people, for teachers, for parents, for everyone in the school community to be treated with dignity? And so that's about the school climate and the school community and what kind of dialogues do we have about building relationships within our schools. We do work with some teacher organizations, and both for creating safe and positive school environments, which is something we work on a lot, but also for academic success. The relationship between students and teachers is hugely important. Being able to talk about what's going on in their lives, about what barriers they're having with the subject matter, and building that one-on-one relationship between teachers and students is hugely important. So looking at this issue of respect and school community and how do we build that is important. Also, in terms of school discipline, how do we stop the focus from being on punishing and excluding students to having processes to address the underlying issues that contribute to student behavior, to keep them in the classroom and get at the root of the problems that are happening to prevent and resolve conflicts. So this issue of dignity, school climate, is the third piece of quality from the human rights framework. The fourth is equity and non-discrimination. And in terms of equity, we're looking at how can we have resources within the school system follow the needs. And so, where there are neighborhoods, where there are individual schools with populations that have higher needs, how can we make sure there's more equitable distribution of resources, but also how can we get at the issue of discrimination, both in terms of access to services, but also treatment within the school system. And so what kind of training and real hard conversations do we have to have with teachers and principals and parents and students and the community about racism that exists structurally as well as in our daily interactions in schools, and how can we try to get at the root of that. You know, in our work around school discipline is a lot of what we do, and there's a lot of focus on the disproportionate rates of suspensions and expulsions for students of color. And there's all kinds of alternatives to suspensions that we promote, restorative justice and peer mediation, but it's also about having very real conversations about what are the biases that people bring into the school system that lead to students being treated differently, and that translates into academics as well. And so part of quality is really confronting and having the real conversations about that. The fifth principle is participation and the rights of parents as well as students to have a voice in shaping the education they receive in their schools as well as the decision-making system-wide. And we heard a lot about how there was parent participation in the school assignment process, and we'd want to see that same kind of participation in conversations about quality that happen district-wide, but also at the local level in each individual school, and setting up the plan for how do we achieve equality in this school. And then the last principle is around monitoring and accountability, and how can we put in place systems that really do a good job of sharing information and having monitoring and accountability processes that involve parents and students and teachers in evaluating what's happening in their schools and regularly using that data and that information to continuously improve education. And so those are kind of the principles and standards that we draw from the human rights framework that help shape what, you know, quality could look like, and it has to be adapted for every city. It has to be adapted for every individual school and community to meet the needs of the people in that community, but that's one kind of framework that folks in Boston could take a look at.
Thanks very much. So what we'd like to do at this point, I know each of the panelists has a great deal more that they'd be interested in saying, responding to one another's comments, but I think the first thing we'd like to do is bring in some of the other voices that are in the room. And so what we'd like to do is open up the floor for comments or questions. And our plan is to take several questions, maybe 3 or 4 comments and questions, and then turn back to the panel to respond to those and to things that they heard from one another. Hopefully we'll have time to do a few rounds of that. That partly depends on your cooperation. And I would ask you, I know this is an issue that is very close to many of your thinking and you have a lot that you'd like to share with us. I would ask you to be as brief as you reasonably can. If you go on for more than 2 or 3 minutes, I'm going to probably try and bring you to a close. But if you can be succinct, it will help us hear more voices and be able to move the dialogue forward. I'm going to exercise the moderator's prerogative just to mention one thing. Several of the speakers have referred to the absence of a federal constitutional right to an education. And I just want everyone to remember, I hope many of you know this, in Massachusetts, as in many other states, there is a state constitutional right to an education. And that's something that probably belongs somewhere in the conversation here. The Supreme Judicial Court has held that the state has a duty to ensure that every child in every school system has an opportunity to receive a quality education, and has held in the past that the state has failed to deliver on that. There is a real and enforceable duty on the state and on its agents, in this case the city, to deliver on providing an education for every child. So with that, who would like to yes?
There's a couple people who approached me about just wanting to briefly announce events to the rest of the group.
Oh,
can we just
absolutely
do that now while people are here? If somebody has an event that they'd like to let the group know about.
I'll take a moment.
Let's give you a microphone. Well, this way we'll be able to capture it on the video.
It's Rihanna Good. This is my colleague, Johnny McGinnis. We teach at the Boston Teacher Union Pilot School, which is a teacher-run school in Forest Hills. and it is a great pleasure to invite you all this evening to the 3rd Annual Boston Educators for Social Justice Conference, which will be held at English High School in Forest Hills Friday and Saturday, May 17th and 18th. It is free registration, free breakfast and lunch, free childcare, free translation and interpretation into multiple languages, and it is guaranteed to be fantastic as it has been in the past. Everyone is invited, from early childhood educators to the university level, families, teachers, community members. So I'm going to pass around a bilingual flyer. If you are not able to attend for some reason, you can skip it. It would be great if you could commit to bringing one other individual as well. That's the announcement part. If there's another announcement, I'll wait, then I'll make a comment.
Any other announcements that people? Okay.
One quick question is just, I'm curious to hear who the members of the Quality Working Group are, if there's a teacher voice on that working group as well. And then a comment based on my experience at our school. We have 330 students, kindergarten through 8th grade. And from a quality perspective, our MCAS scores are okay, but we have a ginormous waiting list for K-1 entry. Just, off the charts, one of the top schools in the district in terms of waiting list. And yet, the MCAS scores aren't necessarily as high as you'd expect. And two implications that I think that come from that we need to look at as we look at quality across schools is, first, who is getting into K0 and K1 classes, and can we give preference to students for whom this is their first school experience, or for ELLs, or for students with special needs? Because right now we have a lottery system, so it tends to be more socially connected people of higher economic status who know about our school or other schools that have K1, and so there are more of them applying, and thus they're more represented due to the lottery. So that's one thing that I think needs to be looked at as we look at school equity. And the second is advanced work classes in testing schools. We have a large number of 6th graders leave us each year to go to testing schools, which start in the 7th grade rather than the 9th grade. And then we have upwards of a dozen open spots that tend to be discipline transfers into our school. And in this past March, last month, we had 7 new 7th and 8th graders in 3 weeks out of a school of 330 students, K through 8, which has a very large impact on our school culture and other elements. So I think that there are some systems in place in the Boston Public Schools that keep it from being equitable, aside from school-to-school basis.
Thank you. Yeah, and if you wouldn't mind identifying yourself, that would be great.
I'm Josh Weiss. I'm a parent of 2 children in the BPS and was involved as an activist in the student assignment reform process. And I have 2 kind of comments. One is, I think that while I certainly support efforts to have an equitable plan and make it more equitable if we can, I think that, first of all, obviously it's a fool's errand to be coming up with any plan that tries to fairly assign students to some high-quality schools and some low-quality schools. That's obviously a problem. I think we all agree with that. But I also feel that realistically, as long as we have high-quality schools and low-quality schools, inequity is unavoidable. Families with means will opt out when they're assigned to poor schools. And we see it happens now. We see lots of families with means enter the lottery system, and those who win the lottery send their children, my family, for example, and those who don't leave the system. And the same happens across socioeconomic classes to some extent, but the families with means always have that option, whereas families without means end up trying to get into a charter school or trying to get into Metco or whatever they find available to them. But we know that families with means always have the option. So I think we have to be realistic that the only equitable system is one with only high-quality schools. My other comment is something I think maybe Megan alluded to this in her comments, which is that our current measure of quality, I think everyone would agree, is insufficient. But one specific way it's insufficient is even using MCAS as a measure of academic progress or academic success, we know that our schools have very different makeups. And when you try to compare a school with, say, 40% of children who receive free and reduced price lunch to a school where 96% of students receive free or reduced price lunch, I think that's probably about the range we see in BPS. We're not really measuring what the school is doing. We're largely measuring a combination of which students are walking in the door and what the school is doing. I think that's the reality, and I'm curious to know if anyone knows of any effort to balance that measurement and really measure kind of what the school, how well the school is succeeding in academics, rather than largely measuring the students. I mean, if you look at my older daughter's school is Boston Latin, and I think you can predict pretty reliably what their MCAS scores are going to look like. I mean, they admit their students based largely on standardized test success, and unless they're doing something really terrible to those students, they will continue to be successful in testing. So that's obviously not an example that's part of the assignment process, but we see the same thing in other schools. So thank you.
Yeah, how about over here?
Thank you. My name is Odette. I have, or used to have, 2 children in Boston Public Schools. They both started when they were 3 years old. I appreciate the example of Hyde Park because that's where I live, and my kids attend school in Dorchester near Franklin Field. Let me say that under the current system, where we have walk zone priority, all of the schools in our current walk zone are in the bottom tier. That is, they're in tier 4. So what does this new system mean for somebody like me who would be starting out? Well, it means I get a basket of schools. In my case, 6 additional schools ranging from tier 1 to tier 3. But let me say that those schools I already have access to under the current system, and I have even more, including the Roosevelt School, which is very popular in Hyde Park, as you know. So what this means for me, what this home-based system really means for me, or somebody like me coming up, is that my choices of schools will be cut in more than half. So I want to focus on that because I believe that the burden of this system that you're creating is focusing on a lot of the low-income students in neighborhoods like mine. Certainly not my kids, because they have access, like I think the gentlemen say, if it's not working for me, I have choices. But other kids do not. And I'm really concerned about these kids, low-income kids in South Boston, in Mattapan, in Dorchester, because especially in Mattapan and Dorchester area, those were the kids who also felt the brunt of the school closings that you had 2 or 3 years ago. So my question for BPS is, what firm commitments will you make to those kids? I would have liked to have seen a plan that would have put those kids, low-income kids who don't have access to quality schools in their neighborhood, who have all tier 4 schools, give them priority at tier 1 schools. So you didn't do that. So what plan are you creating? What firm commitments? Are you putting more paralegals or paraprofessionals in those classrooms, in those communities? What else are you, we're talking about creating plans to improve quality. I want to move beyond plans and to move into commitments for those kids who bear the brunt of the changes in this system.
I'm going to suggest that at this point we invite the panelists to respond to some of the comments and questions. And at the risk of putting you on the hot seat, I'm sort of inclined to start with you, Carlton.
Okay. So first of all, been on the hot seat before, and thank you for your questions. I think it was a great question. So throughout this process, there was a lot of information that was not made public, which we wish we could have made public, but in order to do so, we would have to be able to make sure that we could honor our commitment. And there are several steps that have to take place in order for that to actually happen. There are documents that are in development, so don't start quarrying. What's the word? FOIA-ing it, right? But there are documents that are in development where specific interventions at specific schools are in the works. You talked about the schools in Hyde Park, and I'm not going to name them by name, but I know which ones you're speaking of. And so, it says this is what we're going to do at school A. This is what we would do at school B. This is what needs to happen at school C. And it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, fortunately. It's a very deliberate, high-support, high-touch intervention at each one of the schools. I will name one school, since it's a Tier 4 school, which is the lowest. It's actually a Level 4 school, I should say. It's the Mattahunt School. It's a Level 4 school. And so we know that at that school, certain things need to happen in order for it to turn around. The good news is we've seen lots of success at other turnaround schools around the city. And so we need to replicate that successful menu of services and interventions in order to do that. So there's a deliberate effort to say at the high support schools, we're going to take what worked at our turnaround schools and do just that. Now, a lot of times that's funding that's required. Sometimes that has to do with leadership. Sometimes that has to do with the teaching staff and other interventions. And so all of those are on the table. And so as time wears on, we will begin to say once the school community has been brought into the conversation. Once other changes have been made, we can say specifically this is what's going to happen at school A, B, C, D, and E. And the whole goal of doing that is to address what you talked about in areas where families don't have the best choices or maybe not the same choices. You mentioned that 33%, 87% disparity. We want to be able to close that gap as well so that families don't feel like they only have a 33% shot at getting into a tier whatever school. So there are interventions in the works. We were not able to come out with them just yet because there's work that has to be done in order to ensure it's happening and that we can honor the commitments. But yes, there's a tremendous amount of recognition that what you just described does need to be addressed, and there are folks who are working on doing that.
Can I also ask you to respond specifically
Sure.
to the question of the composition of the quality working group?
Unfortunately, I'm not able to do that. I do a lot of things at BPS, but that's not one of them.
Okay.
So being involved with the quality working group has not been my task. I don't know if, Bob, you have any information on that?
Well, and there may be more current information others from the audience could join in, but I think the formation, it's still in formation. The chairs have been named, Hardin Coleman, who was co-chair of the EAC, and Meg Campbell from the school committee. I believe the two co-chairs who have been named. And I think in terms of other members, it's still in formation.
And Bob, do you want to share any other responses?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on what Carlton was talking about and on what some of the other folks have mentioned as well. Because as the EAC did its work, we got a lot of very important information from folks. One of the things that we knew from folks across the city is many folks said they didn't know the schools in their communities. And so part of what this system is designed to do is to make the school selection process a bit more predictable. That was one of our objectives. And we have seen, and I'm not suggesting this is a panacea, but we have seen instances where families have gotten to know a school, a headmaster, liked what they're seeing, and as we also know, quality means many different things to different people. And so folks have seen something they like in a school and have gotten engaged and then brought their friends and others to that particular school. So I think having a system that is more predictable in that way and gets more engagement at the school and community level, I think can have an important beneficiary effect. I mean, one of the things that we often see is, when we talk about families not choosing schools and having options, one of the things I think about are the number of families that very early on make a decision that Metco is their option and not going to consider the Boston Public Schools. How do we get those families at least connected with schools in their community to know what that option is? Because they're telling us that they are not familiar with those schools at the present time. So I think as this system unfolds, there will be more local engagement with families in schools.
Megan, do you want to respond to any of this?
Sure. So I guess a couple of questions that came up. Josh's question about keeping all families, and if John Connolly were here, I know he would echo that. That's been a major concern of his, and I think, from the beginning of the process, Quest asked the question, why are we doing this anyway? And if we thought, a lot of our speculation was around the mayor's motivation for it, and was this about keeping middle-class families in the city? Was that the motivation? At first it was about transportation costs, and then that was kind of debunked, but we never really got a clear answer on that question. So it's not uncomplicated, but I would say that our first obligation is to families who are here in the city and who are going to our schools. I think that worrying about keeping all families in, to me, is not like our primary worry. Yes, it would be great, but the families are going to leave anyway. Families leave Brookline Public Schools to go to private schools. Families with choices often leave for other reasons other than the one choice. We're very lucky in that we have some choice. Some families who live in suburbs have said to me, wow, we just have to go to our neighborhood school, but that school is not good for my child because my child is really interested in X. Or my child needs a lot of structure, and this school is a much looser school. So I think that we do see some benefits in Boston that aren't seen in some other towns. And it's problematic to me, the idea that we would be interested in providing pure predictability for families based on their ability to buy a good school, i.e. buy a house in a neighborhood with a good school. That seems just inherently wrong. So I personally am not as worried about that as I know some others are. I also want to acknowledge the question that Odette asked about the 3 zones. And I want to acknowledge that this was a very hard process for Quest. And I think we faced criticism at a point about the fact that we were advocating some change from the system when that change would mean a shrinking of choices for families. And it was a really difficult question. I think partially we felt like change was going to happen. And we had a lot of worry about change becoming shrinking into smaller and smaller zones. In fact, starting out worrying about a pure neighborhood school model. So I think that at some point we felt like there was going to be a change and we needed to advocate for change in the best way possible. And we still feel like that advocacy is happening. But really the bottom line is, like, until all our schools are of a certain quality, we're not all going to have our children in quality schools. So I think the system is the new assignment system does not work the way it is now, and it unfortunately gives some families less choices of quality, and I think that needs to change.
I think the only thing I would just add to that, I think the first question brought up was also about sort of, even once you're placed in a school, what are all the other ways that students continue to get shifted or move in between schools that just furthers the inequity? So whether it's access to the testing schools or discipline transfers and other issues that just, looking at the school assignment system, but then also what are all the ways that children are then shuffled in between schools and what impact does that have? But yeah, I agree. I think the bigger question is ultimately, how do we make it so that there are just more quality public schools for everyone to go to?
Peter, can I just add to that a little bit? Because I think and the 2 points that it just made, I don't disagree with those points at all, but I think this is where we need to sort of figure out how we continue this dialogue, because the issues we talked about, particularly when you start to look at where it connects with class issues, it's not unique to Boston. I mean, I don't want it to sound like if they just fixed it, we would be fine. This is a hard issue that I don't think anybody else has figured out yet around the country. So how do we have this conversation and come up with solutions that might work? How do we get schools to a quality level for all students? This is going to take a lot of work that all of us need to be part of.
Before I open it back up to the audience, let me just pose one question that, as I think about this, sort of puzzles me as somebody who's watched the history here. The origins of the assignment issue are in the desegregation suit. And we're coming out of an era where there has been serious focus on integrating the Boston public school system. And Megan mentioned that probably the strongest predictor of a child's success is their family's socioeconomic status, but almost as strong a predictor of their success is the socioeconomic status of their classmates. We also know that Boston remains a city which is residentially deeply segregated, both by race and by socioeconomic status. And so I'm curious, and in looking back at the discussions in the assignment plan, there's been a lot of talk about quality, there's been a lot of talk about transportation, there's been a lot of talk about neighborhood. I'm curious what's happened to the debate about socioeconomic and racial integration, and whether that remains an important priority for the school system, whether it remains an important priority for the rest of us. Is this a system that furthers it, both in terms of ensuring that the schools are seriously integrated on racial and socioeconomic lines, and in ensuring that people have comparable choices and access to the quality of education based on socioeconomic and racial dimensions?
Can I begin to? It's great. So as I was hearing the panelists, as I was reflecting on comments, I was thinking about that actually, about how do I introduce that aspect, because Bob mentioned that predictability was one of the features that we wanted to ensure was in this new plan, but also we wanted to make sure diversity was still maintained and preserved, that there were elements of diversity, that we did not have a plan that was so narrow that you only had a homogeneous group of students attend a school. And that there were some offered, as you may recall, those of you who were a part of the debate, there were some plans that were offered, or at least looked at, where we discussed students, if you live here, you go there, effectively, like in most suburban districts. And so the plan that we have now is very much not that. And if you look at the spectrum of what was discussed and what was debated, we kind of landed in the middle. That instead of having a citywide, you go anywhere in a school district, or if you live here, you go there, two opposite ends of the spectrum, we're really kind of in the middle with this home-based plan, that you do have an opportunity to attend school closer to home, but not close to home or next door, so that you do have a wider range of students who would attend your basket of schools. And one thing we also noticed, and I see Mr. Dresden sitting back there, and I was debating whether or not I was going to mention this or not, because I don't want to misquote your statistic. So you're going to have to help me out if I say this. There, yeah, I bet you would. All right, so, he talked about, and we knew this was going on, that the system that we currently have now most negatively impacts black and brown students in this assignment pattern, that we're sending kids to schools that are of lower quality because of the wide range of choice. Now, I see heads shaking, so I'm going to turn to Mark. Mark, I need you to help me out on this, please. I'm calling. Now you're on the spot. That's okay. So would you please?
Yeah. I'm Mark Drayson. Thank you. And I'm the director of the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, which serves the communities in Greater Boston. I'm also a resident of Rosendale and the parent of 2 children in the public schools here, and a graduate of the schools also. We did a lot of statistical analysis throughout the process. and tried to provide that, I hope, helpfully to the public and to the External Advisory Committee. What Carlton is referring to was the following analysis in our initial report, which I want to try and be very clear about, which is that children of color and low-income children tend to travel farther under the current assignment system and still end up very frequently at low-quality schools. That is not exactly the same as saying that the system disadvantages black and brown children or low-income children generally. It relates very specifically to just this point, which is that a lot of children of color and low-income children do tend to travel far under the current system and still end up at a low-quality school. If you look at the home-based A system, which was eventually adopted, and including the elimination of the walk zone, which I think was an important step that was taken by the school committee toward the end of the process, then what you see in broad strokes is a system which is likely to result in children attending school closer to their home with not much significant impact on the issue of racial segregation in the schools and not much significant impact on equitable access to a high-quality school. Now, folks can decide if that went in the right direction or not, but equitable access remains pretty close to the same. Impacts on integration or segregation of the schools remains pretty much the same, and you get a change in overall proximity. So that I think is something that we need to look at very carefully and ensure whether or not the implementation of the system is going to achieve those modeled results or, ideally, improve upon them by the various ways in which the system is tweaked or adopted. One question which Odette, I'm sorry, I refer to you by your first name because I don't remember your last name, but which Odette mentioned, which I think it's important to look at, is people look at the baskets of schools and say, well, they have less choice now than they had before, fewer schools that they're able to apply for. And I, as a parent, my wife and I searched the schools very, very aggressively, so we liked having the very big basket of choices. Not everybody does that. Not everybody has the capacity to do it. Not everybody is well guided by the information that is presently made available to them within the school system. And so even that system with very large baskets does not necessarily result in equitable treatment for children who vary either because of race or because of socioeconomic status. Megan, I think, pointed out, and maybe others as well, I think correctly, that a very, very important question here is how information and advertising is going to be provided to parents now that they have a smaller basket of schools. Maybe you don't have 20, but you have 6 or 8 or whatever the exact number is. And some of those have to be higher quality schools than would previously be available to you, for example, in your walk zone, let's say. So if you have 6 or 8 schools, maximize the amount of information that's provided to people. Really give them an opportunity to evaluate those schools closely and carefully. Have them make good choices or be in a position about making good choices about which ones they're going to prioritize. That's a very, very important part, I think, of whether or not this system is going to succeed or fail.
Thanks. Let's take one here and one over here.
So there's a couple of, Janet Williams, I'm a resident of Dorchester. And just in terms of my neighborhood, talking about the baskets, there are 2 quality schools, the O'Hearn and the Murphy. And in terms of the population where I live, the opportunity or the chance of parents getting their children into one of those schools is almost not going to happen. And the reason why I say that is because the Ahern is a very small school. It might have 1 grade, maybe 2 grades of each, building on up. And then you have the Murphy that is a K-8. So they build from kindergarten. So the chance of open seats in any of the grades, K-8, is very small. There might be 2 seats in a 2nd grade. There might be 3 seats in a 5th grade. But everyone is vying for those schools within that Dorchester area. So that's not going to happen. So the upside of that is the other schools that are available. And some of those schools are turnaround schools now. So my question is, for those schools that have been turnaround schools for 2 years, what is going to be the information that's going to be given to parents to let them know the status of those schools, if their children are going to have to go there? What is the status of their schools? And I do know one, just based on MCAS, and I know we're looking at lots of things, but they didn't meet their targets. Their 75% target for 2012. So, and this is after 2 years. So my question is, what are you doing when you talked about some decisions around the academic piece have to be made by May or June for the upcoming of this new school assignment? Is what are the plans that have been in place for those schools that have already been turnaround schools, and have they met their benchmarks, have they met their objectives for 2 years? And if they haven't, what has the district, or what is the district going to do to turn that around? Because for the families in Dorchester that can't get into the Ahern or can't get into the Murphy, then they have to access these other schools. So as a parent, what you're asking me is to sacrifice my child's education while you're fixing these schools. And I'm not saying that there haven't been some improvements, but when I look at data, it doesn't make me jump to the ceiling. And so I have to figure out, if I have choices, maybe I can get my child into parochial or the neighborhood charter school or Metco. But for many of the families that live in Dorchester, they don't have those choices, and they have to access the schools. And so you've got to give parents some kind of guarantees from year to year if you have a plan. So you're telling me that if my child is in 2nd grade, at the end of 2nd grade, my child's going to be reading on level, my child's going to be doing this, because I'm going to hold you accountable for that. And if that doesn't happen at the end of the year or whenever the schedule is you're going to say, then it's going to be a problem, because you promised me that that's what was going to happen. So that's the thing. Is in term, my question is, so what is the plans that you have in place already that are the interventions or whatever? Because again, you do have a difference in student learning, and so how do you meet those needs for those kids? So that's the one thing in terms of looking at neighborhoods and baskets and buckets, and I call it the bowl, is keeping certain families in the bowl, and as long as you keep them in the bowl and keep on stirring, we don't have to worry about that, because they're not getting out the bowl to go to that school across town because they're stuck here. It's fine if you want to keep them in the bowl, but the ingredients in that bowl have to be working.
Okay, I'd love to get one more question on the table. Wait for a mic, and then give the panelists a chance to comment.
So with all due respect to you being a lawyer, my understanding of what black parents wanted with desegregation, with filing, doing that legal route, was after like 300 years of trying to do it other ways. And it wasn't really about integration for the black community. My understanding, and I think about Ruth Babson, who was my mentor and friend, she said, Fran, we were devastated when Judge Garrity handed us the decision, because we really didn't think that sitting next to white folks was really going to, like that wasn't what we were about. What we were about was equal access to the resources, because we understood that our black children had the intellectual capacity that white kids did. But we lived in a city and a system that didn't believe that. And so I think that, I'm 53. I started this when I was 15. And I live with white privilege on a regular. And I try to understand structural inequality and racism. And I just think that it would have been much more powerful if the mayor had said, we want to eliminate structural inequality and racism. Let's have a year dialogue around that. So I'd like to ask Sister Liz, and congratulations, I noticed that you were beaming. Honeymoon, wonderful, welcome home. What experience have you had working with districts around institutional racism, systemic racism, and white privilege? Because, you know what, if I had cancer, and I've been waiting for 30 years for the doctors to diagnose it and treat the root cause of inequality. And I just also want to say, poor folks can offer a lot to fixing schools. I don't know anybody who can figure out how to orb in this fine city of ours with less resources than poor folk. So I am really a little disgusted by the notion that socioeconomic class is used as less than. So,
thank you. So I am going to ask, why don't we start over on this side first and give the panelists what's probably going to be their last shot, because we did commit to ending by 8 o'clock.
Sure. So I was just going to say, I don't think I or anyone has had good success having real conversations with any school district about how do we really address structural racism and inequality. I think that more of those conversations are starting to happen, and so in New York City, for example, not on everything in the school system, but a lot of my experience comes from working on school discipline more specifically. We're working with some people at the Department of Education and a couple organizations there and a few schools to really look at how is it impacting this issue of school discipline. And when you look at it, you know, the question of socioeconomic status and neighborhood schools, and you know, there are communities in the Bronx in New York which are sort of have the highest concentration of poverty, and there are schools in that neighborhood which are both, you know, nearby, and they're both 90% free reduced lunch, you know, 90% Black and Latino, and one school is succeeding, and they have students from that same neighborhood both going to those schools. So it's not as if you can't make a neighborhood school in those communities, you know, work successfully for those students. And I think, you know, it's the struggle that you face is how do you replicate that in all of those schools in that community, and what is it about the leadership in that school? And I think the school I'm thinking of specifically in the Bronx, you know, part of it really is about that principal who helped to turn that school around, having really very frank conversations with their students in their classrooms about what's going on in your community and what do we need to do together as a school to turn this around? What is the racism that exists? You know, why do you feel scared, and why is it dangerous for you to walk to school every day? And how does that impact your ability to sit in the classroom and learn? And how does a teacher who lives in the suburbs and, you know, grew up, you know, in Connecticut and now all of a sudden with no experience is teaching you in this classroom in the Bronx? So you know, that whole school came together and talked about what can we do to try to address all of that structural stuff that surrounds us. And there are all kinds of different things they did. You know, they did community tours for the teachers that the students led. It's for them to get to know the community. They looked at their curriculum and talked about how can we change it to make it work. So it's really hard to do that, but I think when I've seen it successful in a school like that, it was really because they had a dialogue, they had that conversation among the teachers and the students and the families and the principal in that local school, in that neighborhood.
Megan, any last words?
Sure. So I hope I didn't imply at all that schools that are made up of students from lower socioeconomic status, that those parents, those families, those children have any less to give. And you know, my personal experience with my kids speaks to that, in that my children for K1 through 6th grade were in a school that was, I think, about 75 to 80% free and reduced lunch. 77, thank you, Fran knows, yeah. You know, it was about 10% Caucasian, I think. It was in a neighborhood that many people in Boston do not want to go to. My children received an excellent, excellent education that was largely, I believe, due to the principal and the teachers and the commitment that they had. The school that they're at now is a school that a lot of people really, really want to go to. And the socioeconomic status at Boston Latin School is extremely different, and I have to tell you that the teaching at that school, unfortunately, pales in comparison to the teaching at the Hernandez. So, amen. Thank you. But there is a factor that socioeconomic status does play, and there was a parent that came to a Quest meeting at one point who had been looking at schools and said, when I walk into a school where there are 95% children on free and reduced lunch, and then I walk into a school where 75% are, that there is something palpably different in many of those schools, and there are outliers. But part of that is because people with resources have resources. And Boston Latin School every year pays out of the endowment and out of fundraising $3.5 million every year. At the Hernandez, we struggled through a family fundraiser every year to raise $10,000. And that means that those schools look different. And parents who have money, frankly, can be very entitled and can walk into that principal's office and demand things that other people sometimes don't feel that comfortable asking. And so those are just some of the effects, I think, that means that there are differences, and it's a sad statement, but there we are. It's our country.
And I would just add one other thing, that even if other people walk into the office and demand those same things, they don't get the same reaction from the administrator when they make the demands.
They don't know the same politicians and the same people with power.
Yep. So, Carl.
Thank you. So to follow on Megan's comments, she spoke about highly effective principals and highly effective teachers as one component to make a highly effective school. We have 3 highly effective principals, in my opinion, retired, sitting back here. And I'm not sure, Barbara, if you were a principal. Okay. So 4 highly effective former BPS members, 3 of whom were principals. And they know the effect that principals and quality leadership has in a school. And so when we talk about interventions, those are also the kinds of interventions that need to take place, ensuring we have highly effective teachers and highly effective principals in the schools. We also need to make sure that we have a distribution of funds, that you talk about the inequities that funding can occur and in terms of what schools can provide. So the school committee a couple of years ago, or at least 2 years ago, adopted the weighted student funding formula, where we are now looking at students as they are and saying, based on your individual student needs, the funding that comes to you will be based on that need, so that we can build up a budget based on student need to try to break down some of the inequities. Instead of having a certain amount per student, that's an average, and if you have special needs, you're suffering because you need more services, and students who don't have special needs, they're getting a gravy. That's now been changed to where we're looking at student by need, the weighted student funding formula. Additionally, when we talk about the bowl, in terms of the school, the collection of schools and the schools that students can apply to, yes, that has changed, but we've also lessened the competition for the schools. So that, we've done studies to say that even though the zones have become more narrow or smaller, the number of kids who are applying to the schools in that same area is less. So your competition is actually less instead of competing across the entire district. So, these measures do actually help. And the last thing is, when that bowl is there, if it's not the same bowl as across town, because of this process, we're now looking at all of the bowls, all of the baskets. We're looking at all of the schools and saying, what's going on? And there are folks who are out in the audience and around the city who are saying, yes, we want accountability. And I think that's one of the beauties of this process, that it says that, yep, we recognize that there are areas that need improvement, and now we're putting out data that shows it, matter-of-factly, and then there are folks who are saying, now, what are you going to do about it? And so we now have to own up to the last part. What are we going to do about it? How are we going to improve quality? What are we going to actually say to families and parents who have children who may not have, the greatest opportunity to get into the small school? Well, you don't need to get into that small school anymore. We want to make sure that all the schools in your basket or bowl have at least a higher level of opportunity for the students who attend.
Bob, you want any final words?
Just a couple of thoughts. One is I think, and Mark made the point about the effect of the school-based Model A. I think what the research shows, if it is implemented the way it should be, it should have a increase in access to quality schools. That should actually improve. It's modest, but there should be some improvement as I understand it. But I think my second point is where I started. I think this is a dialogue that needs to continue, because it really does get at critical issues that we all have to take a look at. One of the things that I'm sure some of you are familiar with is the discussion that's going on across the city under the title of Success Boston. The issue of getting kids not only to graduate from high school, but to get into college and then to graduate from college. And there's a lot of research and work that's being done looking at those issues. And I wanted to, in part, respond to Fran's concern about, the whole issue of socioeconomic status. And it's not, and I think we have to be careful that it's not perceived as, in any way, thinking lesser of folks who don't have means or in any way alienating. It's really about empowering folks because, one of the things that when I talk about it in terms of working at a university, I said, you can go to some communities and everybody's on the same page. The parents, the kids, the teachers, everybody knows that they are preparing those kids to take the jobs that their parents have. And so if mom is an accountant, when that child studies, the understanding is my child's being prepared to go to college and whether an accountant or something else is going to have a professional career. And so when the student comes home and if that math isn't where it ought to be to follow that trajectory, I think to the point that was made earlier, that parent's going to be in the school saying you are not fulfilling your commitment to making sure that my child is there. And so that is a discussion that the families who may not have that job experience, may not have that experience in higher education, they go to school and don't know what the right comparisons are. How do we help parents in that situation navigate this, as I say, begin with the end in mind? How do we help parents understand what it takes for their children and what schools should be delivering to them so that their kids can graduate from high school, get into college, and be successful in college? That's a discussion that we need to have. And so one thing I take away from this whole process is we've come a long way, and this dialogue, I think, needs to continue to address those tougher issues. That's part of the discussion.
So I just want to pick up on those comments and say this obviously is just one stop on a long, long road, and I hope that this has cast some additional light. I would really like to thank all four of the panelists who have shared their very helpful thoughts, and for all of you in the audience who have shared some extremely helpful thoughts as well. And I imagine we'll be at this for some years to come, but thank you for joining us.